I think it's fair to say that Skyrim did for open world RPGs what COD 4 did for competitive shooters. Of course, gaming had already established itself as a mainstay in popular culture well before either of these had entered the fray, but for their respective genres, these two puppies brought in a brand new, more casual audience to the industry as a whole. I think this is particularly true of Skyrim, a game that still stands strong today thanks to its immeasurably elaborate modding scene and still very active fanbase. I could go into further detail on why this is the case and why I think Oblivion failed where Skyrim flourished. In fact, that's not a bad idea for a video. Regardless, I'm here to talk about open worlds today, so here we go. Because Skyrim is still quite possibly the best-selling open world RPG of all time, we are still very much seeing the ripples of its success in the industry today. Ever since its release, the big boy publishers have made it a priority to ape Bethesda's success by flooding the market with open world games. Of course, this isn't just because Skyrim did well. Open world games provide players with more content than a linear experience otherwise would, therefore extending the period of time before the player is likely to trade the game in. As 0% of the pre-owned market goes back to the publisher and by extension the developer, this, in theory, should work. Though of course, it's more often than not about the quality of the content rather than the quantity of it that ensures the player will retain interest. 2015 in particular seemed like the year where this trend reached its apex. So many of the big AAA releases last year were open world, and I know for a fact that I wasn't the only one irked by this. The Witcher 3 and Metal Gear Solid 5, in my opinion at least, were incredible examples of open world done right, but Mad Max and Assassin's Creed Syndicate were just a few of those that fell well and truly short of the mark. So, what makes a solidly compelling open world game? Is there really that much difference between one world and another? Surely the setting makes no difference at all. Well, of course, most of what I'm going to be commenting on largely comes down to preference, especially setting. Size too. My girlfriend would be the first to admit that size is not indicative of overall quality. Just Cause 2 has one of the largest sandboxes in any video game ever, but Shadow of Mordor is distinctly smaller, yet easily as compelling. Then of course we have to make the very important distinction between sandbox and open world. For me, a sandbox can get away with just having decent mechanics and an interesting world for you to exploit. Your Just Causes in your Minecraft, for example. An open world, more specifically an open world RPG, has to have, well, all of it. Great mechanics, intriguing world, compelling characters, immersive story, and all the rest. Of course, there are numerous examples of games blurring lines between the two, Grand Theft Auto 5 for one. That has everything I demand of both subgenres, though that's lacking in any true RPG qualities. But anyway, most of the games of the genre do fit loosely into either of the categories I've described. I think the most important characteristic of an open world RPG is always going to be pacing. Pacing of the mechanics, pacing of the gameplay loops, of the character arcs, and the story. Let's look at two games that give credence to my point. First off, The Witcher 3. One of the finest examples of the genre to be released in recent memory. Universally praised, and rightly so. It has reasonably solid mechanics and great writing, but most importantly, everything you do in the game informs the world building. Every side quest and seemingly minor character you interact with has some semblance of place in the world. There is always something that will further acquaint you with your purpose for being there. It's all so well polished. Not only that, but it doesn't follow the linear sequence of droll, mediocre mechanics that so often plague Ubisoft's open world games. Whilst most quests will have you slashing at something until it dies, that something will always be reasonably interesting to track, investigate and kill, and most enemies will be different enough to ensure the player is always engaged during said sequence of events. Picking a contrast to such a great game is difficult. Actually, it's really not, but preference plays a massive part and I have to take that into account. I may not be the biggest Assassin's Creed fan, but I accept that it does certain things very well. Not to mention that there's very few games I actively dislike. But if I had to pick one, it would undoubtedly be Bound by Flame. A game wrought with questionable design choices and is absolutely rotten to the core. In many ways, it attempts to mirror some of the mechanics found in the first two Witcher games, but with none of the excessive polish CD Projekt Red applies. Of course, the development studio Spiders were working on a fraction of the Polish developer's budget, but that does not excuse some of the frankly awful design choices Bound by Flame exhibits. Now, I'm cheating a little bit here because Bound by Flame isn't strictly open world. It's more sort of hub-based, and despite all my ranting about distinguishing subgenres, I chose to talk about the game because, well, for one, it's shit and any excuse I get to slag it off, I'm gonna take, but also because it counters many of the most important attributes that makes a good open world RPG. Let's just pretend for the moment that it is, indeed, open world, which it nearly is, to be fair. Its combat is repetitive and needlessly difficult the majority of the time. The writing is just awful, Spider's soft, confusing, edgy, with just flat out abrasive, and the quests are astonishingly bland and banal. But worst of all, the world is woefully uninventive, only following the most wafer-thin of already overly used fantasy tropes. Every area of the game feels like it's been ripped from the pages of some of the first Dungeon Master's notes, with elements so unrelentingly uninspired that you often find it difficult to distinguish one area from another. The point to all this is that the key to a compelling experience isn't always the most complex. Again and again we see the big-name developers fall into the same trap of bigger and bolder is always going to be better. It isn't. We've never seen a shred of evidence to suggest that that is the case. Skyrim and The Witcher 3 didn't do well because their game worlds were enormous. They did well because the developers crafted immersive worlds to exist in. I'm getting sick and tired of people throwing the word linear around with negative connotations. The entire foundation for storytelling in video games was built on linear experiences. Some of the best games that represent what this incredible medium can do are still linear. Variety isn't cordoned off to a 3-mile wide stretch of game space. It's layered amongst the fundamentals of what makes gaming great to begin with: player engagement. Film has understood this essential premise for years. You need only look at flicks like 12 Angry Men or Alfred Hitchcock's Rope to understand that audience engagement has never been tied down to the scale of a film set. More importantly, it's about understanding that we can have both. The quaking rise of the indie scene has proven time and time again that gamers more often than not love disparity in their purchases. It's about time the Ubisofts of the world started to understand that. This one's taken me a long time to script, guys. I apologise if I sort of trailed off towards the end there, or the middle, or hell, even the beginning, but it's a subject I think needs to be talked about more often. Open world RPGs are such an important genre to the industry, one that should only be handled by those who choose to do it right. I hope that all of you agree with me there.